how to maintain kosher home maintaining. This is part 2 of our 6-part course. And tonight we will be starting with a discussion for just a moment on bread, okay? Bread, if you've ever gone to a store, you'll notice that all the bread, a kosher store, is parv. Parv means, or like you say, parve, right? It's not meat, it's not dairy, it's like indifferent. It doesn't have, it's non-denominational. It's not meat, non-dairy. Now you notice that most pastries, a lot of pastries are dairy, but bread is not. And that is because the rabbis made a decree that you cannot make bread that is not parv. Bread could either be meat or, it cannot be meat or dairy. You can't mix. It's not common to make meat, but you can't have a mixed, some meat, into the dough of the bread. You can't have butter, which is more common, or milk in the bread. Why not? Because since bread is a staple food that people eat across with all meals, we're worried that somebody will take bread and eat it with their meat and make a salami sandwich or have a nice laffa wrap. But if it was dairy inside of it, now we'll have an issue of meat and milk being eaten together. And therefore, because bread is a staple, they said bread must be parv. You cannot make milk-based bread. Milk, butter cannot be. It's not allowed. Okay, that is the rule. So if someone makes a bread, they go to the store and the bread, they say it's a dairy bread, that's a problem. It's inherently not kosher because the rabbi said you cannot make dairy bread. With 2 exceptions. Before I get the questions, there's 2 exceptions. Okay, first of all, we're talking about the dough before they even get to the exception, right? Pizza with cheese on top of the dough, that's not a question. You see the cheese, right? But even if the actual dough is dairy, you put butter or milk in the dough, in the batter, there's 2 exceptions that will make that allowed. One, if you make a very small amount. In other words, if you make what's the issue? We're worried that maybe you're going to come to have use some of this dairy bread with meat. But if you make a very small amount, which according to the Ashkenazi means just 1 day's worth. According to Svardim, it means 1 meal's worth. And you eat at that meal, that's fine. Because you made a very small amount, we're not worried it's going to be carried over, and then maybe you're going to accidentally eat it with meat. 2 is if you make it in a unique shape, right? So if you make the shape of your dairy bread in the shape of a triangle, that's a weird shape, and that will be very distinctive to say the triangle-shaped bread is dairy, so then that would be allowed. Who here eats barekas? Okay, I eat barekas, okay? And Gershon Parky sells barekas. You'll notice that the bareka makers, they make the different barekas in different shapes. And if you're an expert in the shuk, if you're a shuk machane Yehuda expert, like once upon a time in my life I was, you'll notice that every flavor bareka is a different shape. Potatoes are rectangle, excuse me. Mushroom is triangle. And the dairy ones, I believe, are also always triangle. The spinach is circular, but I believe the dairy ones are always triangle, and that's the way you'll know they made it into unique shapes. You won't have a problem, so you'll know that these are dairy. But according in halacha, if you're going to make bread, you have to make dairy. If you're going to make dairy-based bread, it has to be in a unique shape. That would be the 2 exceptions to the rule. Now, here's a common thing. What happens if you have parv bread, regular bread? You have challah, which is always going to be parv, and you served it at your Shabbos table, which was a meat meal Friday night, and now you have leftover challah. Sunday morning, you want to make French toast. Are you allowed to use the challah if it was never on the Shabbos table? It's not a question. Challah's parv. But once you put it on the Shabbos table, is it now become the status of meat? And the answer is, if it was sliced bread, once you sliced the bread, you sliced the challah, put it in the basket, pass it around the table, right? You slice it to be eaten. Now it takes on the qualification of meat, and you cannot anymore make anything dairy with that. You can't put grilled cheese on top of it. But if it's still a whole challah and nobody touched it, so then it doesn't take on meat, even though it's on the meat table. Now, if you're at a house that has a lot of kids, even and they're touching everything. So then in that case, even if it's just by going on the table, could be already becomes considered a meat, and then you shouldn't eat it with dairy. Okay. Now, when we say something takes on the qualification of meat or dairy, in this case, doesn't mean you have to wait 6 hours, as discussed last week. It just means you couldn't put meat or milk directly on top of this bread. Okay, Rachel has a fantastic question. If you bake the challah in a meat oven, wouldn't it already be considered meat without slice or serving a Shabbos table? Thank you very much, Rachel, for the question. Two reasons I thank you for the question. First of all, it's a great question. Second of all, it leads us to our next conversation. So let's jump into it, okay? And at the end of today, hopefully you'll have a clear answer. Yeah, but the general answer is generally you are right. Okay, generally you are right. Someone's asking, what if the spatula used to mix the challah as meat but wasn't used for 24 hours? These are great questions. We're about to jump into them. So we're gonna learn the rules. Keep them in mind. If by the end of tonight we did not get clarity on these questions, please ask them again or just say following up. Okay. So a meat item cannot be cooked in a dairy pot, and anything dairy cannot be cooked in a meat pot. Why not? Let's understand, take a second to understand why not. We have the prohibition from last week. You cannot mix milk and meat. 3 times the Torah says don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, which means we can't have milk and meat together. We can't benefit from it, we can't cook them together, and we can't eat them together. Those are the 3 prohibitions, okay? But cooking in a pot, there's nothing there. So there's 2 problems with a pot or an oven. One, most blatant, clear problem is not everything in our kitchen is always spotlessly clean, okay? So if you have actual residue, an unclean pot or a not perfectly clean knife, especially if you cut something with a little fatty or butter and stays on, that easily will transfer taste. Point 1. So anytime you have a situation that's not clean, you could easily be moving meat to dairy and dairy to meat. Point 2 is that through heat, metal and pots absorb, and then when you reheat them, that taste comes back out. So let's use an example. If you cook chicken soup in a pot, the walls of that pot through the heat have absorbed some of the taste of chicken. Now you finish your chicken soup. Now you're heating up your pasta, macaroni, and cheese, okay? And when you're heating it up, some of the taste from the wall will come back out of that chicken soup and now mix together with your pasta and cheese, and you have a situation of milk and meat together. These are the 2 things we have to be concerned about when we're mixing milk and meat, but not directly mixing milk and meat, but just through using vessels. Okay, again, 1, things aren't perfectly clean. B, taste got absorbed through heat and will come back out through heat. Those are very 2 important principles, because now we're going to trickle down into the principles. Okay. There's one other principle, though, you need to know. This is an important 3rd principle, which is called something that is sharp. So if a knife, which is sharp, cuts some food that is spicy or sharp, even though it was not through heat, the sharpness of the food and the pressure of the knife could bring out and transfer taste from the metal to the food, from the food to the metal. So if you take a knife and you cut an onion, the onion has considered the law of the knife. If you took a meat knife and cut an onion, that onion now is considered a meat object. You cannot use that onion in a dairy salad. You cannot use that onion in a dairy pot. Okay? Or if you cut hot peppers, or if you cut a lemon or garlic, these sharp or spicy food with a knife, those 2 things create a transfer of taste. And therefore, if you have sharp, which is a knife, and spicy, something that's spicy food, there could be a transfer of taste. Okay. These are our 3 rules. Now, let's now apply. Therefore, a lot of people, ideally, if you're setting up your home, what would be best for you to do is have a power knife. And always cut your vegetables, especially your onions, your garlic, your lemons, your limes, with this knife. And therefore, no matter which way where it goes, you can use it for meat or dairy, right? And then, especially, let's say, a power of cutting board, correct? Would that be helpful? Correct. right? Or you cut on a plate. So therefore, if you cut only a half onion, now if you cut a half onion with a meat knife and you put that half onion in the fridge, you have to remember, wait, that is a meat onion. Oh, make sure only to eat it with meat. But you don't necessarily remember when you cut this onion with this knife and this onion. So like this, cut it with a power knife. You'll never have a problem. In general, if you cut all your fruits and vegetables with a power knife, it'll save you the problem, but especially onion, garlic, hot peppers, okay? So that's just, most houses don't do that, but if you have that power knife, always cut your onions with a power knife. You save yourself a lot of headache and a lot of questions later on, okay? Because what now happens if you cooked, okay, let's say you cook something parve, right? Noodles. Let's talk about noodles. You cook noodles, you're making lasagna, delicious. You're making a dairy lasagna, and you cook the noodles in a meat pot. The pot, could you now use those noodles to make your cheese lasagna? It was cooked in a meat pot. So Gershon is saying no, and he's on Mashkiach. But let's not jump to no quite yet. Let's pull up the slide. This is an interesting walkthrough. There's actually 3 different scenarios that will decide if you could use those noodles which are parve, and they're cooked in a meat pot. Could you use them for dairy? Okay. Scenario number 1. You didn't cook yet. You come home and you want to cook your noodles in a meat pot and then use them for your lasagna. You want to. You didn't do it yet. So the first question, are you cooking anything sharp? Onions? Nope. If not, if you're cooking sharp, you would not be allowed to. You wouldn't be allowed to do that. You wouldn't be allowed. But no, it's not sharp. It's no onions, it's no garlic. Okay. Now we have another question. Have you used this pot within the last 24 hours? Because generally when we kosher, we want a 24-hour layover. Why? Because anything that hasn't been used in 24 hours, even if there is a residue of taste, it's now considered not good taste. So if the pot was not used within 24 hours, if it was used within 24 hours, and you cook the noodles inside of them, you can't use it for your lasagna. But if you cook them it hasn't been used in the last 24 hours, and you want to cook them in a meat pot, and is there no other pot available? There's no other pot available. You'd be allowed to use it. Okay, that's scenario 1. That's if you haven't yet cooked it. But scenario 2, what happens if I already cooked it? I cooked my lasagna noodles in a meat pot. Now what do? It already happened. So now, first question: is it sharp? Is it spicy? If it's sharp and spicy, sorry, it is now taking on the characteristic. You cooked onions in this meat pot. It's now taking on the characteristic of meat. Oh, but it's not. It's pasta. Fine. Was it used within the last 24 hours? If yes, it is taking on the characterization of meat. If it has not been used in the last 24 hours and it's not sharp, and as we said before, it was clean. I want to reiterate this. Obviously, we're talking about we're starting with clean utensils. Then it will be permitted. Our final case, what happens if it's after the fact? In our case, scenario 2, you came to use those noodles before you put them in lasagna. You said, wait, I cooked them in a meat pot. Could I now make lasagna out of them? But what happens if you cook them in a meat pot and you already made your cheese lasagna? Now what should I do? So if it's sharp and spicy, I'm sorry, you got to throw that dish out. But if it's not sharp and spicy, if it was already happened, I don't even have to ask if it's been used in the last 24 hours, it is permitted. That is called if it already happened. Okay? So again, we're looking at 3 things to create that something power become meat through a pot. Is it sharp and spicy? Then it will take on the characterization of that meat. Did it wait 24 hours? And is it clean? Those are the 3 things we're looking at. Okay.
Would you have to then re-kosher said stuff after the fact?
Well, are we in
scenario 3, like after the fact, and if it's okay to still use it, would you then have to potentially?
No, you would not have to. But your question is, what happens if you cook something spicy in a meat pot, like onion in a meat pot, and then baked it in a dairy bake pan? you would have a problem there. Yeah, you would have transferred taste. You would have a problem.
I have a
Okay.
question. What
Please.
in scenario one, what is the definition of availability? Like, what if it's not the ideal pot?
It seems like there's a lot of leniency in that scenario because we're talking about something that's not spicy. It has not been used in 24 hours. You know, it's the pot that you want to use. If it's the right pot for it, it's a pot available, or it's just the right way. Since it hasn't been used in 24 hours and it's clean and it's not sharp and spicy, I would say you can use it if that's the pot that you want to use for cooking.
Okay. And then I have a second question. How come
Sure.
there's so much more leniency, like with scenario 3? Obviously, everything's done and you're ready to eat versus the intent of scenario 1. But
Fantastic
it seems like
question.
there's a lot of forgiveness in scenario 3 and like hardly any leniency in scenario 1. So why?
Very good question. Very good question. General rule in halacha is something called bidi evet, if it already happened. There is lechatchila. Lechatchila means what's ideal. And then we have a scenario called if it already happened. So in scenario 1, we're looking at ideal. Ideal will say, well, no, let's not jump into it, right? Ideal, we want to make everything as perfect as possible. We want to live an ideal life. Scenario 3 is I messed up. What could I do now? So in scenario 3, we're going to give you the most leniency because the person already messed up, right? So in other words, which is a general rule of life, right? If someone comes, asks you a question, which is a good rule when a person asks a rabbi a question. Are they asking, ideally, what should I do? What's the law? The law is that you have to use a meat pot for meat, dairy pot for dairy. You have a question. Rabbi, this is what happened. I already cooked the noodles in the meat pot, and now I made my lasagna. So now it already happened. So now we're going to use much more leniency. That's exactly the difference. And thank you for asking that, to point that out. Okay, now let us move to the items in our kitchen, okay? First and foremost, again, a person cannot cook meat in a dairy pot or use meat in a dairy utensil or meat in a dairy dish. That would be considered mixing of milk and meat, and vice versa. We cannot use or cook dairy in a meat pot, right? That is the general rule, okay? So now let us walk through our kitchen, and we're going to try to, as we walk through our kitchen, go through. Now, ideally, our kitchen should be divided and marked: meat, dairy, and parv. If anybody needs stickers, we have stickers that you can put on the pots, on the utensils, on the drawers of your kitchen. Say this is a meat drawer, this is a dairy drawer. This part of the sink is meat. This is dairy, as we'll see. If you need those stickers, come to me, please. Okay. So we are starting our conversation saying that everything is kosher. We're in a kosher kitchen. Okay. If it is not kosher kitchen, we have to kosher everything, which is waiting 24 hours and then dipping it in boiling water or blowtorching it. If it is kosherable. Okay. Not everything is kosherable, as we'll say in a second. General rule: china cannot be kosher. Okay. So if it's ceramic, anything that's china or ceramic that became non-kosher should be given away. If it's very expensive and it's a family heirloom, it's different. When I say it's different, maybe you can put it back in a kiln. It's worth it to put it back in the kiln. You know, that would be the conversation. I want to say one other rule, though, that before everyone goes and throws out china, is that's only food, china or ceramic that comes in contact with hot food. But if you have a nice, beautiful ceramic bowl that you used for your cold fruit, right? That's fine. That never became non-kosher, right? It only becomes non-kosher if it's engaged with hot food. Okay. So general rule: china, though, cannot be kosher. Okay. What else do we have? Okay, so we want to mark everything. There's gonna be some slides. I'm not necessarily gonna work exactly with the slides, but I'll try to. Okay. Now, what else has to be designated, though? And you can move to the next slide, please, Mitch. Sponges, steel wool, scouring pads. You got to separate. You have to have sponges for meat, sponges for dairy, and if you have a parv, you have to have sponges, steel wool for each. Okay. What about draining racks? So it is better to have separate draining racks and dish towels, but you don't have to because you're only putting one thing at a time and they're clean when you're putting them on. And the dish towels, in concept, if you use them to wipe your dairy dishes, then you put them and you cleaned the dish towels, you ran them in the laundry machine. Now you could use them for meat. So technically, by the way, a tablecloth would be the same thing. You could have a tablecloth that's meat and dairy, as long as in between each time you clean it, that's fine. Okay, but definitely the pads, the sponges must be separate meat and dairy. I mean, that would be a direct transfer of taste. Dishwasher, okay? A person should have a dishwasher that is either meat or dairy. It is very hard to kosher a dishwasher. So your dishwasher in your house, if it is kosher, it's new, let's say it's a new dishwasher, or you koshered it, you blowtorched it, you ran boiling water through it, now designated as meat or dairy, and that's it. The others, you use what they call elbow grease, right? You use your arms to clean the other dishes or get paper and plastic. Okay, so the dishwasher is either one or the other. Okay, what about knives? Knives, we said, remember, knives create the pressure of knives, transfer taste. So knives must be designated. I have a meat knife, I have dairy knives, and I have a parv knife, right? Especially if I want to cut onions with parv and keep them parv, I should keep a parv knife. Your challah knife, really should try to keep it as a parv knife, right? So that the challah doesn't take on meat, although it's not inherently a problem. But knives, you cannot use a meat knife for dairy and a dairy knife to cut your meats. Not allowed to do that. You have to have separate sets of knives. Again, good idea is to mark each thing what it is. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Microwave. A microwave, again, should be meat or dairy. If you travel, or if you have a microwave at work, and that's how you heat up your food, you could wrap your food in a double wrap, right? And let's take 2 Ziploc bags and leave them slightly open so the air gets out. It's microwavable proof 2 wrappings and heat it up. That's really what they're doing on the airplane. If you order a kosher meal on the airplane, essentially it's double wrapped. If it's double wrapped, that's how you would heat something up in a microwave. Another option is to clean the microwave very well and then put in a boiling cup of water. Because in order to kosher anything, you first have to clean it well. So if you want, you can clean the microwave well. I don't think you're going to do that at work, so you can double wrap the food before you put it in the microwave. Okay, oven. I grew up, and most people grow up, that the oven is either meat or dairy, okay? The oven is either meat or dairy, and that's what it is. So, well, that's what you should do. A person should designate their oven as, let's just say, it's a meat oven, okay? The person says, my oven is now a meat oven. That's it. I only cook meat in it. Now, what happens if now it's coming Shavuos, and I want to cook dairy? So I have 3 situations that could help me cook dairy. One, but before I even get to my 3 scenarios, this scenario will only work if the oven is clean, right? So if I cook dairy food, which is completely dry, so what would be dairy food? Let's say you're not going to have a lot of dairy food. I feel like all dairies are sauces, but in theory, I guess if you had you're heating up a cheese based muffin, or a muffin that had some butter inside of it. Okay, so if the oven is completely clean, now most ovens aren't completely clean, but in theory, if you keep a really clean meat oven, if it's dry, you can heat it up. Most people won't do that. Most people will use item 2. They would double wrap the milk item, so you could double wrap your food, double wrap your pasta, and heat it up in the meat oven. Or what you can do is you essentially could kosher the oven. How do you kosher the oven? You make sure that the oven is clean, and then you run it on the highest temperature for 45 minutes. Some people say you have to also wait 24 hours in between. Okay, so you have to wait 24 hours, clean the oven, let it run for 45 minutes on the highest temperature, and now you have koshered your oven. Not for Pesach, but that is good for regular kosher. So that, which is very nuanced, and it's a big deal. So that's why most people say, okay, make it meat and stick with it. And if you want to do dairy, get a little toaster oven or something. Okay, Mitch, exactly asked about toaster oven. Toaster ovens are very, very hard to clean. So most people say you cannot kosher a toaster oven. If it is just a bread, those toasters that you put 2 slices of bread inside, you push it down, that never took on meat or dairy. That's par, right? Because you're only putting par bread inside of it. Toaster ovens are basically impossible to clean. So if you want to use a toaster oven, you would have to double wrap something to put in a toaster oven. So again, ovens designated as they are, they're meat or dairy, and that's it. If you want to kosher them by cleaning them and then waiting 24 hours and running them in the high temperature for 45 minutes, you can. But then make sure to kosher it back when you're done, because not to forget, is it meat, dairy, where am I holding? You won't know where you're holding. Okay? That's an important rule, so I hope that was clear. Any questions on the oven, please do ask. All right, oven mitts. Oven mitts ideally should be 3 sets, meat, dairy, and parv. Not so important. The issue of oven mitts would be if you're spilling, right? If the juices are spilling into the oven mitts and they absorb, a lot of the schmutz. That's what we're worried about, and then maybe they would transfer.
Aviva had a question in the chat.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. I'm not following it enough. Okay, so yes, if you make lasagna, which is dairy, in a meat oven, if it's double wrapped, yes, you can. No, if you're double wrapping the lasagna, you do not have to wait 24 hours. Essentially, double wrapping is protecting that no taste gets transferred either way. Yeah. I also saw before, sorry, maybe clarify if you're using a whole clove of garlic or onion knife, doesn't have to be part. Right. If you're using, when we said the rule of a knife needing a parv knife, that's if you're not finishing the whole item. But if you finish the whole item, that would be fine. Meaning you don't have to, you could use a meat knife or a dairy knife and just cook dairy or meat, or put in a meat or a dairy pot. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay. What about your refrigerator or freezer? It's not a problem, because remember we said that taste only transfers through heat or dirt. So as long as you keep a clean fridge and you're not putting your slabs of meat directly on your shelf of your fridge and your cottage cheese piled high, literally you dump it out of your container on your fridge. So yes, then they could easily mix. But if you're keeping a clean fridge, it's not a problem. You can have the same fridge, the same freezer right next to each other, as long as there's some sort of wrapping between them. Now, if you're having, let's say, putting in pans of chicken or juices that spill, you're worried that things might spill. Obviously, if one spills into another, that's a problem. So you want to make sure that things are properly covered, or the things that might spill aren't in a place that they'll spill from meat to dairy or vice versa. But it's short of that, you do not need 2 fridges or 2 freezers. You do need to keep things properly wrapped. And the things that sometimes, you rewrap in a little plastic bag, those things you should probably keep separate in dairy just so that they actually don't mix. Okay, what about a sink? So if you have a nice from home, when they build from homes, they build 2 different sinks. Or at least they have a sink that has 2 parts to it. That is ideal. Okay? That's ideal. And if you have one sink that just has 2 parts, essentially you should cover the part that is not being used right now so it doesn't splash over. Okay? But what about if there's only one sink, like most of us we have in our house, that's what we've always had, right? So that sink is not kosher. It's not kosher. Why? Well, for the simple reason, you put meat in there, you put dairy in there. It's not kosher sink. So what are you going to do? The issue is maybe you'll put a hot dish on the floor of the sink and taste will transfer. Or maybe you put hot meat or you poured hot milk or hot dairy object, right? Your hot coffee down on the sink. So the sink is non-kosher. It has hot dairy and hot meat. So therefore, what you should do is get 2 racks. A rack that you put down before putting any dairy dishes in the sink so they don't touch the floor of the sink. And separately, now when you want to do the meat dishes, you put down a rack and then you put the meat dishes on top of that rack. You never put dishes directly in the sink. Okay? Especially, you want to be careful if it's hot. Especially if it's hot. That is what you want to be careful of, right? Especially if it's a hot dish, a hot pot. if it's a glass cup on a stem, fine, you don't have to be so nervous. But ideally, you should not put anything directly down on the sink. The sink is not kosher if it's one sink. That's why you want to get 2 racks. Try to get 2 different color racks. Again, you can take the stickers, one that says meat and dairy, and that's how you've now divided between the sink and the sink racks.
You need a parv one too, right? Theoretically.
If you're having parv dishes, you would need a parv one, yeah. Now, you could also, if you just have one parv, now you don't have to get a whole parv sink rack. You could just, hold it and not put it down when you're cleaning it. That would be the solution.
Same rule true for that. If you, let's say you had like 1 or 2 dairy pots and you never put them on the bottom, but the rest is all meat.
So you would just need to get a meat rack, but you still can't put the meat directly in the sink because you're pouring milk in that same sink. So the base of the sink is trev, right? Because even if you're not doing it at the same time, you're transferring over from meat to dairy, et cetera, et cetera. Both tastes are in this sink. Okay, very important question we got. What happens if the entire sink fills with water? That is a very good question. Because of that, some people don't only have sink racks, they actually have tubs. So yeah, you want to be careful not to fill the sink with hot water because that would potentially be a problem. Yes, the answer is that would potentially be a problem. Mitch, do we have any more slides on this point?
I have a question.
Oh, we do. Okay, yeah, I knew. Yeah, okay, please.
So what if, okay, so your sink is trafe and then you have a meat rack. Let's say you filled the sink, like I don't know, for some reason got, like the water was building up and it maybe went over the rack, but the water is not hot. Is that fine or does that affect the rack?
The general rule is if it's cold water, it's fine.
How about like warm water?
If you put your finger in it and it hurts, that's hot.
Okay.
Now you might have more endurance. Let's say a baby. Let's use a baby's finger in it, okay?
Okay.
Okay, stovetops. If you're starting your home, try to designate meat stovetops and dairy stovetops. Why? The main issue of stovetop is if there's actual residue. If it's not clean, and you put something on a pot on the stovetop and there's actual, cheese that spilled over from your grilled cheese, or there's actual little piece of meat, now they'll touch the pot and make the pot that you put on top of them that, let's say, dairy. And then the pot on top, though, is milk. So the issue of stovetops are that you might actually have actual residue. If not, we say when you turn on the fire, it will burn it away. It'll get rid of any problems. So try to keep clean stovetops. Ideally, what most people do is they designate these 2 are meat, these 2 are dairy. If you're one time you say, no, I need more burners, it's coming Shabbos, I need the dairy burners for Shabbos, that's fine. Just give an extra look and make sure they're clean before you use them. If they don't look so clean, turn it on, let it run for 60 seconds, and then use those dairy stovetops for meat. Again, the main issue we're looking at here is because there might be actual residue that would transfer over. Tables. So your table, the general rule is most people keep their table dairy. That's the most common. If the table is dairy, then anytime you eat meat, you put a placemat and you eat on top of the placemat. Or you just always eat on top of placemats, meat or dairy. A lot of people have that thing where just like, you don't put like cups or bottled water or liquids on top of tables. You don't want to ruin them. So a lot of people, they don't want to ruin their tables. So they'll always use placemats. But if not, designate your table as either meat or dairy. And then when you're eating the opposite, so if your table is always dairy, when you're eating meat, always use a placemat, a napkin, something. Especially though, when you want to put like a hot dish on the table, make sure to put down underneath it some sort of like pot holder or towel or something. Toaster oven was already asked before. Toaster ovens are very hard to clean. They get very dirty. They're very hard to clean. Generally designate them just as meat or just as dairy. I know most Manhattan homes, the oven is always meat and the toaster oven is always dairy. Just keeps it just for the amount of meat that they're cooking versus dairy. But if a bread toaster that's only for bread, and since bread is always parv, that's fine. It will be parv. Okay, what about glass? We didn't talk about glass. Well, the reason is because there's a famous thing that the Sephardim say you could use glass for meat and dairy. So if it's a glass cup, your glasses, your wine glass is technically used for meat and dairy. Sephardim say even your glass plates you can use for meat and dairy because they say it doesn't absorb taste. The challenge with using the same cups for meat and dairy, even for an Ashkenaz, or the same plates for a Sephardi, is you have to make sure they're super clean between use. Because again, when we say that glass is fine for meat and dairy, right, we mean that the heat absorption isn't going to be absorbed in and coming out. But if it's not perfectly clean, right, then you have a problem no matter what, because you have a little residue of butter, and now you have a little residue from the meat that was, or the milk, or that was in the fat that was touching on it, and now it easily transfers. So if you're using the same cups, you got to really always be careful that you're really making sure everything is always super clean. That's very hard, and that's why it's really, even though halakhically for the swine they can use the same plates, and for Ashkenazim, if it's always cold, they could use the same cups. It's not a good idea. So how do you wash them during sponge or parv? Great question. They could technically wash them with either, but the problem is it would have to be super clean. Or if you're washing your glass cups, you could wash it with meat or dairy, because we're saying the glass doesn't absorb. The glass doesn't absorb, so therefore you can use meat or dairy. The thing is, you have to make sure it's super clean and there's no residue, because if not, there's a chance, that God forbid, of prohibition of meat and milk being transferred, because now you're making a coffee in that cup that just a short while ago had chicken soup in it, or was used at a meat meal, and someone was touching it all over with their meat, and the kids were putting little pieces of meat, bone marrow, tartar in there. Who knows what they're putting in, right? So that would be a direct challenge. Okay, to sum up what we discussed tonight, we discussed bread. Bread has to always be parv. You can only make bread not parv if it's small amounts, or it is unique designation. Pots, right? If you cook in a meat dish or a dairy dish, does the neutral item that's cooked in it take on its characteristic? If it's sharp, yes, it does. If it was not clean, yes, it does. If it was, right? And if it wasn't within 24 hours, ideally you should not use it, but if it was already past 24 hours, you could. What about specialty challah made with deli? The question I just got. So let's say someone makes deli roll, that's clear what it is. If something has a special form, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to in deli, but a special form that would be considered to be clearly designated, and everyone knows it's meat, or vice versa. And then we went through the kitchen. Again, things that are metal could be kosher, china cannot be kosher, glass. According to the Sephardim, it's not a problem. You don't need to kosher it. Ashkenazim would say you do, but it would have to be super clean regardless. In order to keep things kosher, generally we want to divide between meat and dairy, and just always keep meat and dairy separate, and all meat and dairy utensils separate. Scenarios that we could use the same are the fridge, the freezer, things that are always cold, things that are hot. If you want to transfer them, the way to do it would be through koshering. Make sure that it's not dirty, making sure there is no residue left, waiting 24 hours, and then koshering would be a way to transfer over from meat to dairy, or vice versa. We went through the microwave, the ovens, stovetops, dishwasher, which all right. Stovetops you don't need as much to designate, but the other ones you do need. We need separate sponges. We need separate knives. Those are critical. Okay, this was great.